Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a truly gripping piece of nonfiction, Adam Higginbotham's acclaimed book, Midnight in Chernobyl. Now, what we're going to do here is explore this incredibly dense, fascinating history through the perspective of a reader who went into it completely blind. Whether you're a major history buff or someone who only vaguely knows the name Chernobyl, this explainer is designed to unpack exactly why this book is considered a masterpiece of historical reporting. All right, let's dive into this.
But before we get into the heavy details, I want you to ask yourself honestly, what do you actually know about the Chernobyl disaster? I mean, if I asked you to pinpoint the exact decade it happened, or how massive the scale of the event truly was, what would you say?
Well, if you guessed the 1960s, or maybe you thought it was just this relatively small, localized incident affecting one specific town, hey, you're definitely not alone. It's a super common misconception. But the terrifying reality, it happened much later in 1986, and it absolutely wasn't just a localized problem. It was literally the single biggest nuclear disaster the entire world has ever seen.
And that brings us right to the book's subtitle, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster. Throughout this explainer, we're going to see exactly how this book shatters those common misconceptions we just talked about. It delivers this meticulously detailed, deeply researched, and honestly, genuinely anxiety-inducing account of a tragedy most of us only think we understand.
So let's get into Section 1, Anatomy of the Disaster, from Bureaucracy to Meltdown.
Higginbotham masterfully breaks the narrative down into three distinct phases. He doesn't just start with an explosion, right? He starts years prior, detailing the really flawed construction of the plant as this major milestone project for the USSR. Then, he moves us into the frantic peak week of the actual meltdown in '86. And finally, he wraps up with the long-term aftermath, including that massive global fallout. It's just a brilliant way to structure such a sprawling event.
What the author reveals here is that this disaster was absolutely not just some sudden, unpredictable accident. No way. It was the result of a culture of extreme secretiveness. People were basically fudging numbers to make things look better than they actually were. They were cutting major corners just to meet these arbitrary deadlines. It was this intense web of bureaucracy where a whole series of small, compromised decisions ultimately stacked up to create a massive catastrophe.
But the book doesn't just focus on the politics. It dives deep into the science, too. To help you grasp exactly what went wrong inside that reactor, the book essentially gives you a crash course in high school chemistry. It takes the time to define foundational terms like atoms and isotopes, so even if you aren't an expert, you can breathe a huge sigh of relief. You walk away with a solid understanding of the physical science behind the meltdown, empowering you to actually understand the mechanics of what went wrong.
Moving on to Section 2, The Global Aftermath, A Scale Beyond Ukraine.
So after detailing the intense week of the meltdown, the second half of the book shifts gears to the terrifying consequences. Officials had to figure out how to stop the ongoing radiation, which led to the creation of the sarcophagus, this massive containment structure hastily built right over the ruined reactor. And as noted in the text, sarcophagus is a perfectly apt, totally dystopian name for an architectural necessity that frankly looks absolutely terrifying.
But here's the thing, the threat couldn't be entirely entombed. The fallout became a massive global event. It started with mass local evacuations, sure, but then radioactive smoke began drifting all the way across Europe. It literally drifted as far as Switzerland, where they actually started detecting increased reactor levels. This step-by-step progression really hammers home that Chernobyl wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a crisis that spilled right across borders.
And yet, despite how massive this all was, there is a truly staggering reality we have to face. The long-term effects remain unknown. The book points out a really fascinating scientific reality here. Unlike with fast-breeding plants or animals, human reproduction is slow. Because so few human generations have passed since 1986, we still simply do not have the data to fully comprehend the true long-term genetic and health effects on the exposed populations. We are literally still living in the shadow of this unknown.
All right, Section 3, Information Density and Scale, the Human Element.
As you dive deeper into this history, you're going to immediately notice the sheer, overwhelming scale of the human element involved. You are dealing with a massive cast of generals, government officials, and everyday plant workers. In fact, it's so dense that the author had to provide dedicated reading aids. We're talking a cast of characters page, detailed maps, photos, and an epilogue, just so you can track who lived and what happened to them. It's a huge undertaking.
The sheer scope of this event gives the book an incredible historical and emotional weight.
The text makes a really powerful comparison here, stating that reading this is sort of akin to studying the sinking of the Titanic or 9/11. It's one of those monumental, unpredictable events. Unpredictable, actually, primarily because crucial information was withheld from the very people who needed it most. It creates this incredibly deep feeling of inevitable tragedy as you turn the pages.
Because of that creeping inevitability, this book doesn't just read like a dry history textbook, it reads like a high-stakes thriller. You constantly find yourself asking, was anyone gonna live? You're reading about real people knowingly putting their lives at extreme risk just to figure out the problem and stop the disaster, and it fills you with genuine anxiety. It completely hooks you emotionally, right from the very first page.
This brings us to Section 4, the reading experience, and how to actually consume a masterpiece. Because the subject matter is so intense and so heavily detailed, Adam Higginbottom had to strike a very delicate balance. He pairs these fast-paced, highly engaging action scenes of the disaster response right alongside incredibly dense, highly informative scientific and historical context. It is exceptionally well written, for sure, but that density means you kinda need a game plan.
So how do you actually approach it? Well, first, you might want to avoid the audiobook format. Honestly, it's just too much complex information to process by ear for most people. Second, stick to reading only 1 or 2 chapters a day. Give yourself the permission to slow down and really process the details. And finally, whatever you do, don't stress yourself out trying to memorize every single general and government official's name.
Instead of getting bogged down in all those minute details, just let the massive scale wash over you. The author's goal isn't to test you on a list of names, it's to give you a true sense of the magnitude of the event. Use that slower reading pace to fully absorb the incredible scope of the tragedy and the staggering, heroic problem-solving of the folks on the ground.
Midnight in Chernobyl is just a monumental piece of nonfiction. It's gripping, it's terrifying, and it absolutely demands your focus and respect. It reveals a history steeped in secrecy and completely unmatched in its global impact. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with one final question to consider. Knowing what you know now about the scale, the lies, and the immense human cost, are you ready to face the untold reality of Chernobyl?